I've been trying to see angels over the last 2 or 3 years in particular. What I've been trying to do is maybe, in a very light way, an approach that's sort of Steiner-ish. And I don't know much about Rudolf Steiner. I know there are many people in the room that will know a lot more about him. But from the sense that I have of Steiner, this maybe is not unconnected, which is basically to try to make connections with my own experience, such as it is now, by imaginatively developing it, as well as trying to discern it through what you can read otherwise, to flesh out, you might say, my own experience of angels through a glass darkly, to use Paul's metaphor. And so what I wanted to offer is a sort of third talk this morning, and maybe this fits in as a third take on this subject, is kind of where I've got to with that. Wanting to see angels came about through two things in particular. About 3 or 4 Christmases ago, I had a flu bug, and was for about a week or so was in bed, and it was one of those bugs which, as long as I kept sort of still and warm, I didn't actually feel too bad. But the minute I started to try and do anything else, I had zero energy. So I had to sort of stay in bed for about a week. And it was around Christmas time. And I read and heard on the radio a lot of the Christmas themes going on. And it very much struck me that Christmas seems to be a time full of angels. The angels appear in the heavens to the shepherds. The various actors in the Christmas story are warned by angels. Joseph is warned by an angel. The beginning of the Christmas story, the incarnation, of course, is announced to Mary by the advent of Gabriel. So I was thinking, why does this time of year seem to be so closely associated with angels? Why does Christmas itself seem to be so closely associated with angels? A kind of working hypothesis I have is that often angels seem to appear visibly, or we sense their presence somehow through times of transition. I don't know whether we kind of enter a more liminal space imaginatively ourselves. We feel less sure of things, and often when we feel less sure, we can become alert to influences outside of ourselves. Certainly, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, many more angels were named in the century or two up to the birth of Jesus. So in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. This is during the Hellenistic period, or the time when a lot of what are now known as apocryphal texts were written, particularly texts like 1 Enoch. And it seems that was a time when people became much more alert to the angelic world. Angelology, as it's known in the Judeo-Christian tradition, was really born then. And that too, I guess, was a time of transition, uncertainty, waiting, as people came to realise. As Barfield put it, it was the time when, as it were, the tide of one cycle of evolution was kind of reaching its turning point, that it then did with the birth of Jesus. And so that kind of that moment of hovering almost, it feels akin to a kind of time of uncertainty, not knowing, but also thinness, when people become more perceptible, a bit more capable of perceiving what forces that are at play, that then become associated with angels. Anyway, so I've wondered whether, of course, Christmas is the turning of the year and so on as well. So I started to think, maybe there's something going on, and I'd like to develop that if I possibly can. And then the other thing that happened was that, partly in order to pursue this myself, I had come across the writings of a woman called Lorna Byrne, who's now very, very well known in the angel world. I was watching YouTubes of her talks as I was lying, in my my fluey stupor. I got a couple of her books and read her books. She quite quickly struck me as onto something that seemed very real, and it was my psychotherapist's hat that made me think this, because she seemed to have always known about angels, experienced angels very directly in her life. If you don't know, she She's an Irish woman who had been seeing angels ever since she could remember, and then since she's been in her 50s has started talking and writing about it, and particularly in the last 5 years or so has developed a very substantial following now, and her books sell by the millions and so on. But what really struck me in the stories that she relates and the advice that she gives when she gives talks is that angels seem to function for her to take us more deeply into experience, even often very difficult experience, rather than, as it were, defending us against experience. And the psychotherapist in me thought, this is an experience that she has that's not trying to take her out of life, trying to minimise things, which is often what people can do when they're too frightened or not capable of entering into an experience more fully, and they're used as defences, to use a psychotherapeutic term. Whereas she seemed to be suggesting that angels actually take you more deeply into life, and including the darker side of life, the suffering side of life. And she herself has known this very directly. She suffered two of, I think, the most traumatic experiences that anyone can suffer. One was the early loss of her husband, her partner, and then perhaps even more devastating was the loss of a child. One of her children died. And the angels, who she always saw, told her about this, told her this was going to happen, and were there to lead her into this experience and through the experience. And then when she gives talks, people often seek advice or insight and so on. And generally speaking, her advice and insight often seems to be gently, sometimes quite directly actually, encouraging people to enter more deeply into this experience as they possibly can, even if it's dark and difficult. So she seemed to be non-defensive in the way that she talked about the angels. And I've subsequently actually asked a couple of my colleagues, I work at the Maudsley Hospital in South London, to look at video clips of Lorna Byrne and tell me what their impressions were. It's sort of confirmed to me that whatever they make of her experience, they would agree that they don't seem to be defensive experiences, and they're certainly not psychotic experiences and so on as well. She doesn't split. She doesn't do lots of the things which people otherwise do who are suffering, essentially, and are using angels to try and ameliorate their suffering in some way. She also seems quite wise and to have related visions that chime with other people's experience who are better known to have seen angels. People like William Blake, for example, or in the early church fathers, as they're known, people like Origen and so on, who talked about experiences of angels. And Lorna Byrne, who is otherwise an uneducated, illiterate woman from the west coast of Ireland, seems to have had very similar kinds of experiences. So one which she relates in one of her books is she sometimes gets taken to heavenly realms and shown things, which she's started to talk a bit about. And one of these experiences which struck me very profoundly was she talks about how she had a vision of human souls before they're born being allocated their guardian angels. And the experience she describes seemed to me very, very similar to an experience that Origen describes. So I sort of sense these correspondences, and I don't know quite what to make of that. I've not seen this myself, but nonetheless, just the pure correspondence seemed to me to suggest that this otherwise uneducated person seemed to be seeing something directly that other people who were very educated, people like Origen, had sensed or seen in some way or other themselves. So I thought this woman, Lorna Byrne, is really fascinating, and I wanted to engage more with her. There's lots of these when you start to notice them. For example, she has talked about the angels that look after trees and plants, and how they're one angel, in fact, whereas we have individual angels. And this seemed to chime with what Aristotle said about the souls of plants, that there's one soul for all plants, whereas we have an individual soul as human beings. So not exactly direct links, but patterns and correspondences that seem to chime. So I got rather fascinated by Lorna Byrne. I've half suggested this already, but to try and develop my sense of this, I went back to the figures that in the past, people like William Blake. I like William Blake, I live in South London. He's kind of our local mystic, and famously saw angels in the trees on Peckham Rye. he's one source to turn to for sort of direct experience of angels and trying to put this into art or to write about it in poetry and so on. I did a physics degree at one point. Was very interested in Newton's inspiration, Isaac Newton's inspiration. And it's thought now that his interest in more esoteric sciences as well as the exoteric sciences, such as physics, they actually mutually cross-fertilized each other very powerfully, in fact. Research done on where he got the idea of gravity from, for example, action at a distance, how different planets can attract, stars attract, galaxies attract. He was inspired to think about gravity from his reading of, in Neoplatonism, around angels, that too seem to have attractive or repelling properties, and he sort of formalised this for the physical world. And in fact, when Newton's laws of motion were first published, they inspired as much a whole new strand of science. They inspired all sorts of new interest in things like astrology and so on as well, because people thought that he might be talking about these old esoteric sciences as much as the new science of the time. So again, I don't know quite what to make of that, but it just seemed there were resonances and things chiming there. The person I knew the most about, having done my PhD on Plato, was Socrates. It's widely attested in Plato and other sources from the times that Socrates was directly conversant with a demon, is the Greek, but demons only became sort of bad guys in about the 1st century BC. So in the 4th and 5th century BC, Socrates and Plato's time, they were just go-betweens. Plato said that Socrates regularly conversed with a demon, that Socrates himself associated with the god Apollo. Plato actually, in the Symposium, suggests that maybe Socrates had a kind of angelic side somehow. Again, I don't know quite what I'm talking about, but he likens Socrates in the Symposium to Eros, that had been known as a god with a lowercase g, and maybe a bit like the Elohim, were the gods with lowercase g's in the Bible. But that Socrates said, no, well, actually Eros is a demon, is an angel, because Eros is an attractive force that moves between human beings, and that Socrates seems to have been so fused with this god Eros, often translated as love now, that he almost seemed to take its form to Plato. Plato writes in the Symposium. So Socrates was a fascinating figure for this, and what particularly struck me that I really liked about Socrates' account of his demon was that the demon always told him what not to do. It was a sort of negative way, and this struck me very powerfully because people like Dionysius, who we've heard about today, Pseudo-Dionysius, they're known as much for their angelology as for their apophatic theology, which is the way of not knowing. And so this sort of negative way seems to be really important in Socrates' life as well. And what it seemed to do particularly for Socrates was by telling him what not to do, it left him in a place of uncertainty and doubt. And it was in that place of uncertainty and doubt that he himself came more fully into himself. He had to kind of wrestle and struggle a bit in that zone, that liminal space. Again, this sort of sense of liminal space is starting to appear, and become more fully himself as a result. And sometimes his demon told him rather trivial things not to do. Sometimes it was, don't turn left, and he would sort of say, well, what's that about? So he turned right, and in Plato's dialogues, he has an encounter that then is rich in some way or other. It tells him to stay sitting where he'd been sitting in another place, and some people appear and they have a kind of encounter. So it seems rather random and even laughable. But he sort of learned to follow this demon, and his life enriched through this process of struggle and encounter as a result. Sometimes the demon told him not to do things which were very climactic in his life, and the most obvious example of this is when he was in prison awaiting the hemlock, having been condemned by the Athenians to drink the hemlock. And he could have escaped quite easily. He could have gone into exile. He could have asked some of his wealthy friends to pay a bribe, and he could have left. But the demon said, no, you mustn't leave. Again, leaving him this space of not knowing. And it then, through particularly the Phaedo, one of Plato's dialogues, it became very clear why the demon told him not to leave. And because then he was able to enter the most liminal space of all, at least for we humans, which is the cusp between life and death, which became the sort of fulfillment of his whole life. And a great inspiration to all sorts of people afterwards. So the demon there guided him to sort of the climactic moment of his life. So this started to make me feel, well, maybe one of the ways which maybe we encounter angels is when we're in these liminal moments, when particularly we're told not sort of what to do, as if we get a sort of blinding light and step into the future and everything seems to be joyous and happy and easy, but actually when it's the more tricky, difficult, uncertain moments of life. This certainly seemed to be the experience of Socrates, and the benefit of this was that we become, well, you used the phrase several times, co-creators. The phrase which I landed on is the Pauline one of co-workers. And I like that extra sort of notion of work, because we're called to do something here, as well as, though, be co-workers and to be led into something which is more than just our own work. Seems to be Socrates' message, and Lorna Byrne too seems to be drawing people in this direction, from a very different time and place, but nonetheless doing that now. She became a bit of a Socratic figure to me, although it's the last thing that she would think of. I turned to the medieval view, where an awful lot was written and thought about the angels amongst the scholastic thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus, and all sorts of others, drawing a lot on Pseudo-Dionysius. And similarly, a lot of their reflections and speculations seemed to resonate with all this as well. There was a lot of discussion about whether angels have bodies or not, and if they do, what sort of body that might be, how they can have a presence in a world like ours, which is local. I'm here, you're there, we're here, others are elsewhere. How angels can impact a world of place and time. Broadly speaking, they turn to what we would think of as maybe thought, what I think in other contexts are called subtle energies. I think in modern psychotherapy is sometimes referred to as the unconscious. And this seems to be some sort of in-between, again, liminal. You get this sense of liminality, in between, as it were, pure thought, disembodied thought, which presumably is timeless, placeless. God is often described as atopos, as placeless. And us that are topos, that are in particular places. Thought, subtle energy, angels seem to inhabit this in-between zone. That's certainly how many of the medieval philosophers and theologians thought about it. So angels become associated with the kind of movement that's not a physical push, but is a willed movement that doesn't cause something like I could cause this glass to fall over with the movement of my hand, but maybe is the element where I thought of doing that. So a kind of intelligence that moves in that sense. And again, it links back to Aristotle, who talked about the unmoved mover, that sense of engagement with the world. I was very interested in what you were just saying there about how angels are thought to communicate sort of by a sort of direct experience, rather than by being told something, like I'm doing you. The angel would illuminate from within, as it were, and this seems to be something the medieval people felt. And also, another thing which you notice very powerfully is angels are associated with particular functions or particular dynamics or particular experiences. We're associated with being particular people with sort of multiple facets of that, different characteristics, different sides to ourselves, some good, some less so good. Angels seem to be associated with particular things, particular functions, particular dynamics. And this, I think, is particularly fascinating because it links to psychology. And in fact, a lot of medieval angelology feels quite like modern psychology. Jung makes this famous remark that the gods have become diseases, and maybe the angels have become our inner life, would be another way of putting that. And in modern psychotherapy, this takes me from the medieval engagement with this to my own, as it were, practice of psychotherapy. I wonder whether angels can be linked to that through this way, that in modern psychotherapy, we use models that were devised by people like Winnicott after Freud, which is sometimes known as object relations theory. It's a rather clunky and horrible phrase. But nonetheless, the broad idea is that our inner lives are populated by sort of sub-personalities, personalities, part personalities, that very much shape our inner experience, and that when we are suffering for anxiety perhaps, it's often because these personalities are in some sort of conflict. This is the sort of model that's used, that's envisaged to try and deepen your engagement as a psychotherapist with someone's inner life. The Jungian counterpart to this would be complexes. Jung talked about affect-laden complexes, and you know them not by meeting a person, you know them by meeting an affect, by meeting a feeling. It may be a very powerful resistance. Sometimes they're even felt as sort of knots or localities of affect that you would even feel in your body, a sort of almost physical manifestation of a subtle energy, you might say. And this idea of objects or complexes seem to correspond very much with how angels have been talked about. And again, this took me back to Lorna Byrne, because she described experiences where, for example, she'd be at a book signing, as she often is now, and she'd see an angel behind a sort of third person down the line saying, just pay attention to this person as they come towards you. Not quite clear why, again, this sort of sense of not complete clarity, but a sort of tip-off or a message, to use the angelos word again. And she's learned to pay attention to this. I mean, she sort of sees it very directly, I believe. So how could she do otherwise? But in psychotherapy, part of the training of psychotherapy is first of all to learn to pay attention to your own sort of nudges and tweaks and anxieties, fears, insights, images, to learn to pay attention to that, in order that you can then learn to pay attention to the insights and nudges and feelings that are unspoken in the people that you're working with. And it's very routine in psychotherapy, both in a psychotherapy session and then in supervision, to either reflect or to talk about, it felt like something wasn't being said, or there was a sense in the room that, or there was a third thing that seemed to be wanting to be heard or spoken about. We do this all the time in psychotherapy. We think about it in terms of people's inner lives, perhaps as a result of their development. But I wonder whether, as it were, the external counterpart of this is how people have talked about angels, how Lorna Byrne experiences angels. As Owen Barfield put it very nicely, we don't just have our own inside world, there's the inside of the cosmos as a whole, and that our unconscious is part of the unconscious of the world as a whole, of nature as a whole, and that there's a link there to be made. And in the modern world, we've just got so used to talk about our inner life as if it's just going on inside our heads, maybe just inside our bodies as well. But there's this correspondence again, which in the medieval world, in the ancient world, would have been thought about in relation to angels. So angelology and psychology seemed to me to be very linked as well, and gave me more of a sense of how I might see angels. These three elements then, the ancient philosophy, and particularly Socrates' uncertainty, being asked to co-work with what's going on in life, in order that we ourselves might become more fully human, more fully developed people, but also somehow partaking in the development of things as a whole. The medieval notion that led me on to the psychology, and then how modern psychotherapy has developed ways of talking about people's inner lives that seem to have a lot of relationship to angelology as well, through these part objects, complexes, which we know as the insights, the wanderings, dreams they come up in, as well as everyday life, particularly in anxiety and doubt and uncertainty, certainly because that's how people come to psychotherapy, to try and sort this out, make some sense of it, understand the meaning of it, rather than, as it were, just get rid of them, which is can be an approach that people want as well, of course, because they can be very troubling indeed. I then got to meet Lorna Byrne, and I did a piece for the radio about angels on the Sunday programme on Radio 4. I got to speak to her before, and what I wanted to put to her was whether my explorations chimed with what she sees directly. Because I said to her, I wanted to do this radio piece, but not talk about it in this rather spectacular way. Sort of, I don't know quite what sense to make of it, but people do have these experiences. There we are, as it were. But whether my attempts to try and connect angel experience with my own experience directly made sense to her. And so I met her in a sort of hotel lobby in London, off Holborn. I remember the Bee Gees were playing on the intercom, and she came to the room. She seems very lovely, sort of humble person, chatty. She sits down, and immediately I see that she's kind of looking around the room. Her eyes are sort of looking over my shoulder and so on. And I said to her, you seeing angels? And she said, yes, of course, your guardian angel's right behind you. I've never met anyone that doesn't have a guardian angel. And I did say, so what's it saying to me? She said, I'm just checking in with it to help guide our conversation a bit. And I tried to explain to her, the psychotherapy concepts a bit, and as far as it's not straightforward. She sees these things directly. You might say she's clairvoyant, and I think of her as having some sort of synesthetic gift. Actually, how some people see a colour and feel a feeling, or hear a sound and have an emotion very directly, or see a number, and it's those kind of cross. I'm not saying that she's synesthetic in a clinical sense, but as a model for me to understand what I might feel as something, she, as it were, sees directly. I asked her what my guardian angel looks like, and she says how sometimes angels appear in a human form. She talks about how they give the appearance of a human form. Sometimes it's more colour, sometimes it's a sense of presence or shimmer. So that sort of seemed to resonate. But the fact that she is illiterate, can't actually. Well, she can read and write a little bit now. But when she first started writing, she actually dictated her books, and then her daughter, I think, originally wrote them out. And now she's a bit of an industry. So she has an editor at Hodder who does it for her. But nonetheless, I talked to her about this, and she said, well, the thing is that when you learn to read and write, you also learn how to structure your world. And this can be very, very valuable indeed, because it helps us to communicate, it helps us to live in a world with others. She had a lot of problems with not being able to read and write. It's not an idyllic place to be at all, but nonetheless she wonders whether it kind of, rather than sort of, as it were, pinning life down, as an education in reading and writing gives you for good and ill, she lived in a sort of slightly undifferentiated zone, and that kept her open from childhood, maybe even, to this presence of angels, this life associated with angels, and that sort of made sense to me somehow. That's partly perhaps why she sees these things which are otherwise closed off, or so it seems. I mean, I now feel that these things are actually much more open to us than perhaps we realise, but there's a lot of hints and tips and nudges in our everyday experience that we don't just have to sort of sit around and hope they show up, but can actually develop, can really work at. I think of my own psychotherapy as not just trying to help me understand my own problems, which were considerable at one point, but we're actually had a spiritual development now, which I'm only really beginning to understand as well, a kind of correspondence in that way too. So meeting Lorna Byrne, gave me the sense that maybe I was onto something, as someone who has this ability to see these things directly. It seemed to make sense. And just to finish with a little synchronicity that, in this witty way, that sometimes these experiences seem to tell us we're on the right path. I was one day reading one of her books, and had to stop reading the book and leave my house to go to get the bus to go into town for the meeting. But I took the book with me and put it in my pocket. The section of the book had been saying, ask your angels to show themselves. Don't be bashful. Be as open as you can and ask your angels to show themselves. And when I read things in books like this, I'm still anxious enough to be a bit fearful in such moments, thinking, what am I really asking for? Be careful what you pray for and all that. But I put my book in in my pocket and went out to the bus stop. And then as I was waiting for the bus to appear, I took out the book and was flicking through, trying to find the page that I had been reading. And the first words that came into my sight, as it were, in the book were half a sentence that said, "You might be at the bus stop." One of those strange synchronicities that nonetheless seem to suggest that I might be onto something too.